the weight of silence. The concrete walls of cell block H had witnessed 43 deaths since Vinny Torino arrived 8 years ago. He'd counted them all: overdoses, shankings, one man who simply stopped breathing in his sleep. Death was currency here, traded in whispers and settled scores. But what happened after Tank Washington's humiliation would make all those deaths seem like paperwork errors. Vinny sat on his narrow cot, fingering the rosary his daughter had sent him before she disappeared into Witsec. The beads were worn smooth from 8 years of prayer, or what the other inmates assumed was prayer. In reality, each bead corresponded to a name, a debt, a thread in the web he'd been weaving since the day they locked him away. The bruise on his cheek had already faded. Tank's slap carried the weight of theater, not genuine violence. The real damage was in the message. The old Italian rat was fair game now. Vinny had watched it ripple through the yard like blood in water. Conversations stopped when he passed. Eyes lingered a heartbeat too long. Even the Aryan Brotherhood shot callers started whispering. They thought Tank had broken some unspoken protection. They were wrong. Tank had broken something far more valuable, the carefully maintained illusion that Vincent Torino was harmless. Guard Captain Martinez made his evening rounds, keys jangling against his belt. He paused at Vinny's cell, just long enough for their eyes to meet. A slight nod, nothing more. 8 years, and they'd perfected the art of invisible communication. Martinez had 3 kids in college and a mortgage in Colorado Springs. He also had an envelope that arrived monthly, always cash, always exactly enough to cover his daughter's medical bills. Lights out in 10, Torino. Martinez's voice carried just the right amount of institutional indifference. Yes, sir. The guard moved on, but not before dropping a folded newspaper outside Vinny's cell. Page 6 would have a circled obituary, some nobody from Newark who died of natural causes. But the date would tell Vinny everything he needed to know about Tank Washington's associates on the outside. 3 cells down, Tank was holding court. His voice carried the confidence of a man who'd never been truly challenged within these walls. He was explaining to his lieutenant, Jerome Ghost Walker, how disrespecting a mob turncoat would bring respect from the Mexicans, the Aryans, even the guards. Old man's finished, Tank's voice echoed off the concrete. Been walking around here like he still matters, like anybody gives a damn about some paisano who sold out his own blood. Vinny almost smiled. Tank wasn't wrong about the selling out part. The difference was scale. Tank thought small: drugs, protection, the petty kingdom of ADX Florence. Vinny had sold out 5 crime families to the FBI, while simultaneously selling out the FBI to those same families. The beautiful thing about playing all sides was that everyone thought they owned you. The newspaper obituary would confirm what Vinny already suspected. Tank's nephew, Marcus Jr., was working construction in Baltimore. His sister Keisha just opened a beauty salon in Oakland. His mother lived alone in a rent-controlled apartment in Bed-Stuy, Building 4B, Apartment 3C. She fed stray cats and took the same route to church every Sunday morning. Tank Washington commanded respect through violence and reputation. Vincent Torino commanded something more powerful: information, patience, and a network of debts that stretched from these concrete walls to the highest levels of federal law enforcement. The lights went out. In the darkness, Vinny began counting rosary beads. Bead 1, Agent Sarah Chen, FBI task force leader who thought she was running an asset but was actually washing money through her husband's tech startup. Bead 2, Warden Phillips, whose gambling debts to the Torino family went back 15 years. Bead 3, Dr. Marcus Webb, the prison psychologist who'd been filing reports about Vinny's deteriorating mental state, while those same reports allowed certain medications to be smuggled to specific inmates. By dawn, Tank Washington would discover that humiliating Vincent Torino was the worst decision he'd ever made. Not because Vinny would retaliate directly, that wasn't how the game worked at his level, but because Tank had forced Vinny to reveal that his 8 years of playing the broken old man wasn't protection, it was preparation. The rosary had 53 beads. Each one represented a person who owed Vincent Torino their career, their freedom, or their life. Tomorrow, he would start collecting. Tank thought he'd cornered a rat. What he'd actually done was wake up the man who'd spent 8 years turning America's most secure prison into his own private office. The only question now was, how many people would have to die before Tank understood the difference between a mob turncoat and a mob architect? Outside his cell window, Vinny could see the first hint of sunrise bleeding across the Colorado mountains. 71 hours remained until lockdown, until the FBI task force, until everyone realized they'd been guarding the wrong man all along. Time to make some phone calls. The architecture of memory. The first call would have to wait until morning rec time, but Vinny's mind was already 3 moves ahead as he watched the Colorado dawn paint his cell walls gold. 26 years ago, he'd made a promise to a dying man that would determine how the next 70 hours unfolded. His father, Anthony Old Tony Torino, had lasted 3 days after the cancer finally won. In those final moments, when the morphine couldn't touch the pain anymore, the old man had gripped Vinny's hand with surprising strength. "You listen to me, Vincent. This life, our life, it ain't about the money or the respect. It's about the people you can't let go. You protect what matters, no matter what it costs you. Everything else is just business." Old Tony died before dawn on a Tuesday. By Thursday, Vinny had already started building the network that would eventually swallow the entire East Coast operation. But the old man's words carved themselves into his chest like scar tissue, and for 8 years in ADX Florence, they'd been the only thing keeping him sane. What mattered was Isabella. His daughter's photograph was the only personal item allowed in his cell, a Polaroid from her 16th birthday, taken 3 months before the FBI raids that changed everything. She was wearing a yellow sundress, laughing at something his wife Maria had whispered in her ear. The corners were soft from handling, but her smile remained perfect. Isabella was 24 now, somewhere in Oregon, under a name he wasn't allowed to know. The WITSEC protocols were absolute. No contact, no letters, no confirmation she was even alive. The photograph was 8 years old, but it was all he had of the life that mattered beyond these walls. Tank Washington thought he'd found Vinny's weakness when his sources discovered Isabella's existence. What Tank didn't understand was the difference between a weakness and a weapon. Every man in ADX Florence had someone they protected. Wives, mothers, children, sisters. The smart ones kept those connections buried deep. The dead ones let their emotions show. Vinny had spent 8 years appearing to be the latter, while actually perfecting the former. The breakfast bell echoed through cell block H at 6:30, followed by the mechanical chunk of locks disengaging. Vinny rose from his cot with the careful movements of a man who'd learned to hide his true strength behind the performance of age. His back genuinely ached. Concrete mattresses for 8 years would break anyone's spine. But the shuffle he effected was pure theater. Guard Martinez appeared at his cell door with 2 newer officers Vinny didn't recognize. Fresh faces rotated through ADX Florence every few months, but the smart ones learned quickly that certain inmates required different handling. Martinez had been here long enough to understand that Vincent Torino's cooperation wasn't mandatory. It was purchased. "Morning, Torino. You've got a visitor request?" Vinny's expression didn't change, but his pulse quickened. Visitor requests were carefully choreographed events. His attorney, David Kellerman, only came when there was news about Isabella's security or updates from the outside that couldn't be transmitted through normal channels. What time? After Rec 10:30. The timing was perfect. Morning Rec would give him access to the phones, and Kellerman's visit would provide cover for information that needed to flow in both directions. Tank's humiliation had accelerated a timeline Vinny had hoped to stretch for another year, but adaptation was survival in both the mob and federal custody. Walking to the yard, Vinny passed Tank's cell. The gang leader was doing push-ups, his massive frame moving with the mechanical precision of a man who'd built his reputation on physical dominance. Tank's lieutenant, Ghost Walker, lounged on the opposite bunk, reading a letter from someone named Shanice, who apparently missed him something terrible. "Morning, old man," Tank called out as Vinny passed. His voice carried the casual cruelty of a predator who'd already marked his prey. "Sleep okay? I know how you old-timers get nervous about change." Vinny paused at the cell door, meeting Tank's eyes with the tired resignation Tank expected to see. "I slept fine, Marcus. Thank you for asking." Tank smiled. He'd been testing whether yesterday's humiliation had broken the last of Vinny's spirit. What he saw confirmed his assumptions, a broken old man trying to maintain dignity in the face of inevitable destruction. If Tank had been more observant, he might have noticed that Vinny was the only inmate in cell block H who used Tank's real name instead of his street name. He might have wondered how a mob turncoat knew details about Tank's background that weren't in his official file. He might have questioned why a man supposedly cut off from all outside contacts seemed to know exactly when guard rotations changed, when new inmates arrived, when federal task forces were scheduled to visit. But Tank Washington saw what Vinny wanted him to see, an old man clinging to outdated protocols of respect while the world moved on without him. By tonight, Tank would understand his mistake. The question was whether that understanding would come before or after the people he loved started disappearing. The letter. The payphone in the rec yard hummed with 8 years of accumulated secrets. Vinny had made exactly 217 calls from this specific phone, always during the narrow window when guard rotations created a 40-second blind spot near the northeast corner. Today would be different. Today, he wouldn't be asking for favors, he'd be calling them in. His fingers moved automatically to the worn number scratched into the phone's metal housing. Not visible to casual observation, but clear enough if you knew where to look. Agent Sarah Chen's direct line, the one that bypassed FBI switchboards and her partner's surveillance. She picked up on the second ring. "Package delivery," Vinny said quietly, his voice lost in the yard's ambient noise. "Same route, expedited shipping. Copy that. Tracking number, Wednesday, sunrise, client satisfaction guaranteed." The line went dead. 26 words that would put Tank Washington's entire world under federal surveillance within 12 hours. Chen had been waiting 8 years for Vinny to activate their arrangement. Her career depended on the intelligence he provided. His life depended on her never understanding how completely she was being used. Vinny hung up and turned toward the wait stations, where Tank was instructing 2 younger inmates in proper bench press form. The gang leader's massive frame moved with surprising grace, demonstrating technique while holding court. Tank caught Vinny watching and offered a mock salute, the gesture dripping with calculated disrespect. "You need something, old man? Maybe spot me on the heavy set?" "I'm fine, Marcus. Thank you." The same polite deflection Tank expected. But this time, Ghost Walker looked up from his conversation with interest. Jerome Walker had survived 12 years in federal custody by reading subtleties other inmates missed. Something in Vinny's tone had shifted, though Ghost couldn't identify what. Guard Martinez approached with a manila envelope, his expression neutral. "Torino. Legal mail came in early. Your attorney's running late, but he wanted you to review this before your meeting." Vinny accepted the envelope with steady hands, though his chest tightened. Legal mail arriving ahead of Kellerman's visit broke 8 years of established protocol. Either something had gone catastrophically wrong with Isabella's security, or the outside world was moving faster than anticipated. He found a concrete bench near the fence and opened the envelope with deliberate care. Inside was a single sheet of federal letterhead and a smaller envelope marked personal effects, deceased. The federal letter was brief. "Mr. Torino, we regret to inform you that Maria Elena Torino, age 52, passed away on September 18th due to complications from pneumonia. As her next of kin, you are entitled to receive her personal effects. Given your current custody status, these items have been reviewed and approved for delivery. Our condolences for your loss. Federal Marshal Service, WITSEC Division." Vinny stared at the words until they blurred. Maria. His wife had died 6 days ago, and they were just now telling him. 6 days while he'd been counting rosary beads and planning Tank's destruction. His wife had been buried in some anonymous cemetery under a name he'd never know. The smaller envelope contained a single item, Isabella's baby bracelet, the one Maria had worn around her wrist since the day they entered witness protection. Pink plastic beads spelling out Isabella in child's letters. The bracelet Vinny had bought at a hospital gift shop 24 years ago when his daughter was born. The world tilted. 8 years of careful control cracked like ice under pressure. Maria was supposed to be safe. She was supposed to be protected until all this ended, until the grand design finally played out and he could bring his family back together. The plan had always included Maria. Tank's laughter carried across the yard. Some joke Ghost had made about the new fish in cell block D. Normal prison conversations, normal prison concerns. Tank didn't know that the broken old man sitting 30 feet away had just lost the only person who knew his real name. Vinny closed his eyes and felt 26 years collapse into this moment. Maria making Sunday gravy while Isabella did homework at the kitchen table. Maria crying when the indictments came down, begging him to fight them instead of cooperating. Maria's last words before they took her away, "You better have a plan, Vincent. You better have a way to bring us home." He'd had a plan. A perfect, intricate plan that would take 10 years to execute and leave him controlling both sides of the law. Maria was supposed to live to see it finished. She was supposed to forgive him when she understood what he'd really accomplished. The baby bracelet weighed nothing in his palm, but it contained the gravity of 8 wasted years. Time he'd spent playing chess with federal agents and prison gang leaders, while the only person who mattered slipped away from him one day at a time. Tank Washington thought yesterday's humiliation was about respect and prison hierarchy. He was wrong. What Tank had actually done was strip away the last reason Vincent Torino had for pretending to be someone he wasn't. The broken old man had died with Maria. What remained was something much more dangerous, a father with nothing left to lose. The baby bracelet made no sound when Vinny slipped it into his pocket, but the weight of it seemed to echo through the concrete yard. He sat motionless on the bench, watching Tank Washington demonstrate proper deadlift form to a circle of admiring inmates. The gang leader's voice carried clearly across the space, confident, instructional, completely unaware that the grieving man 30 feet away was about to destroy his world. Vinny tried to stand and found his legs unsteady. 8 years of disciplined control, and Maria's death had reduced him to this, an old man struggling to rise from a bench. The irony wasn't lost on him. For the first time since entering ADX Florence, his weakness was genuine, and everyone was too distracted to notice. He needed to reach his cell, needed privacy to process what came next. But as he shuffled toward the entrance, Tank's voice cut through his grief like broken glass. "Yo, Torino, you look like somebody died." Tank's laughter followed the words, casual cruelty disguised as prison humor. "Bad news from the lawyer?" The other inmates chuckled appreciatively. In the hierarchy of federal custody, kicking a man when he was down wasn't just accepted, it was expected. Tank was simply maintaining his reputation, grinding down the mob turncoat who'd forgotten his place. Vinny stopped walking. For a moment that stretched like a held breath, he considered telling Tank Washington exactly whose wife had just died. Considered explaining that Maria Elena Torino had been the only person alive who knew where 47 bodies were buried, who held the real bank accounts, who could have testified about the night Vincent Torino killed a federal judge in Atlantic City. Instead, he nodded politely and continued toward the door. "Just business matters, Marcus. Nothing that concerns you." It was the right response. Submissive, defeated, exactly what Tank expected. But Ghost Walker was watching again, his expression thoughtful. Something about the old man's composure didn't match his obvious distress. Ghost had survived 12 years by reading inconsistencies other inmates missed. "Tank," Ghost said quietly, waiting until Vinny was out of earshot. "You ever wonder how come Torino knows your government name?" Tank paused mid-repetition, the barbell suspended in his massive hands. "What you mean?" "Every time he talks to you, he says Marcus. Not Tank, Marcus, like he read your file or something." Ghost's voice carried the careful caution of a man who'd learned to trust his instincts. Most of these old-timers, they don't even know the guards' real names. For the first time since orchestrating Vinny's humiliation, Tank Washington looked uncertain. ADX Florence operated on strict information protocols. Inmates knew what the prison wanted them to know. Street names, general charges, public information, real names, family details, outside connections. That intelligence was carefully controlled. Maybe he heard it somewhere, Tank said, but his confidence had shifted. Guards probably talk. Ghost shook his head slowly. "Nah, man. Think about it. Torino's been here 8 years, longer than anybody in H Block, longer than some of the guards, and yesterday, when you put him down in front of everybody, he didn't react like no broken snitch. He reacted like what? Like somebody who was deciding something. The weight room had gone quiet. Other inmates sensed the change in atmosphere, the subtle shift from casual conversation to serious concern. In federal custody, paranoia wasn't a weakness, it was survival. Tank set the barbell down with deliberate care. You think I made a mistake? I think maybe we don't know as much about Vincent Torino as we thought we did. 20 feet away, guard Martinez finished his cigarette and crushed it under his heel. His radio crackled with routine chatter, meal schedules, medication calls, the mechanical rhythm of institutional control. But Martinez wasn't listening to the radio. He was watching Tank Washington and Ghost Walker through the yard's chain-link fence, noting the body language that suggested their conversation had moved beyond casual prison politics. Martinez had been expecting this moment for 8 years. Vinny had warned him it would come eventually, some incident that would force the careful balance of ADX Florence to shift. The guard captain reached for his phone and dialed a number he'd memorized but never called. This is Martinez. The package is ready for delivery. Copy that. Timeline? Sooner than expected. Client is motivated. Martinez hung up and walked toward the yard entrance, his keys jingling with practiced authority. In 6 hours, Tank Washington would discover that humiliating Vincent Torino was the worst decision of his life. But first, Tank would spend those hours beginning to understand that 8 years of assumptions about the broken old mob turncoat were about to prove fatally wrong. Inside the prison, Vinny sat on his narrow bunk, holding Isabella's baby bracelet up to the fluorescent light. Maria was gone. The plan had changed, and for the first time since entering federal custody, Vincent Torino was about to stop pretending he was anyone other than exactly who he'd always been. The most dangerous man in America. The weight of secrets. Vincent Torino's cell felt smaller, with grief occupying half the space. He sat on his narrow bunk, Maria's death certificate spread across his lap like evidence of his own failure. The federal paperwork was clinical, sterile, complications from pneumonia, as if 26 years of marriage could be reduced to a medical term and a case number. His hands trembled as he reached beneath his mattress, fingers finding the loose concrete block he'd worked free during his second year at ADX Florence. Inside the hidden cavity lay 8 years of carefully accumulated secrets, photographs, letters that were never sent, and a small black notebook filled with names, dates, and locations that would topple governments if the wrong people found them. But tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight he pulled out a single item, a wedding ring on a thin chain, the one Maria had worn during their last dinner together before the raids. She'd slipped it to him during their final embrace, whispering that she'd wait for him to bring her home. Vinny closed his eyes and felt the weight of promises he'd never keep. Maria had died believing he was a federal informant who'd betrayed everything they'd built together. She'd lived 8 years thinking her husband was the kind of man who traded family loyalty for government protection. The truth, that Vincent Torino had orchestrated the greatest deception in organized crime history, had died with her. The truth was that there had never been any federal raids. Vincent had staged his own arrest, using contacts he'd cultivated over 15 years inside the Bureau. The indictments against 5 crime families weren't the result of his cooperation. They were the product of his ambition. Every boss he'd supposedly betrayed had actually been eliminated on his orders, their territories absorbed into a shadow empire that stretched from federal holding cells to the streets of 12 major cities. Agent Sarah Chen thought she was running Vincent Torino as an asset. What she didn't understand was that Vincent had been running her since the day she graduated Quantico. Her career, her cases, her reputation, all carefully constructed to serve his larger design. The broken mob turncoat was the greatest role he'd ever played, and it had cost him everything that mattered. A shadow passed his cell window, Ghost Walker, moving through the corridor with the predatory awareness of a man who sensed shifting currents. Vinny quickly replaced the wedding ring and closed the hidden compartment. Ghost's instincts were sharper than Tank's, and suspicion was spreading through cell block H like infection. Torino. Ghost's voice was quiet, respectful but probing. My condolences for your loss. Vinny looked up, meeting Ghost's eyes through the cell bars. I'm sorry. Word travels fast in here. Legal mail, personal effects from the deceased. That's heavy news to carry alone. Ghost paused, studying Vinny's reaction. Lose somebody important? The question hung between them like a test. Ghost wasn't offering sympathy, he was fishing for information, trying to understand why the old mob turncoat suddenly felt dangerous instead of broken. Prison politics demanded careful responses to careful questions. My wife, Vinny said simply. Pneumonia. Ghost nodded slowly. Maria, right? Pretty woman from what I heard. Shame she never got to see you make it home. Ice flooded Vinny's veins. Maria's name wasn't in any file Ghost should have access to. Her identity had been sealed by WITSEC protocols since the day she entered protection. Either Ghost Walker had connections that reached far beyond ADX Florence, or someone was feeding him information from the outside. How do you know my wife's name, Jerome? Ghost smiled, but the expression carried no warmth. Same way I know about your daughter Isabella. Same way I know about the house in Oregon and the bank account in her new name. Information's a currency in here, Vincent, and lately people been spending a lot of money learning about you. The cell walls seemed to close inward. 8 years of careful operational security, compromised by Tank Washington's curiosity and Ghost Walker's connections. Someone had been digging into Vincent Torino's protected family, which meant someone suspected the federal witness protection was a fraud. What do you want, Jerome? I want to understand why a broken-down snitch gets phone calls from FBI agents who ain't supposed to exist. I want to know how come Tank's sources can find information about your daughter that the federal government claims don't exist. And I want to know what happens to people who ask too many questions about Vincent Torino. Ghost stepped closer to the bars, his voice dropping to a whisper that wouldn't carry to the surveillance equipment. See, Tank thinks yesterday was about respect, but I think it was about timing. Like maybe you've been waiting for an excuse to stop playing whatever game you've been playing for 8 years. Vinny stood slowly, meeting Ghost's gaze with steady eyes. For the first time since entering federal custody, he allowed his true nature to surface, just a glimpse, just enough to confirm Ghost's suspicions. You're a smart man, Jerome. Smart enough to know that some games have consequences. Ghost nodded, unsurprised by the threat in Vinny's voice. Tank's planning something for tonight. Something permanent. You might want to consider your options. As Ghost disappeared back into the corridor's shadows, Vinny returned to his bunk with hands that no longer trembled. Maria was gone. His cover was blown. And Tank Washington was about to discover that humiliating Vincent Torino hadn't broken him. It had set him free. Vinny sat in the darkness of his cell, Maria's wedding ring cold against his palm, when the first piece of his carefully constructed world began to crumble. The revelation came not as a thunderclap, but as a whisper. Ghost Walker's voice echoing from the corridor, speaking in hushed tones to someone Vinny couldn't see. Told you the old man was more than he seemed. Tank should have listened. Agent Chen's been asking questions too, real specific questions about the Torino operation. Vinny's blood turned to ice. Agent Sarah Chen, his supposed handler, the federal agent who'd been running him as an informant for 8 years, was asking questions about him. That made no sense unless... The second voice became clearer as footsteps approached. Guard Martinez, speaking with the casual confidence of a man who believed he was alone. Chen figured it out last month, started pulling old case files, cross-referencing Torino's intel with actual bus dates. She realized something was wrong with the timeline. Vinny pressed himself against the cell wall, every muscle frozen. Martinez continued, unaware that his words were destroying 8 years of careful planning. Turns out our boy Vincent's been feeding the Bureau information they already had. Information that was too accurate, too detailed. Like he wasn't betraying mob operations, like he was orchestrating them. Ghost's laugh was soft and bitter. So, what's Chen thinking? She's thinking Vincent Torino never flipped at all. She's thinking he's been playing the federal government from day one, using his informant status to eliminate competition and consolidate power. The raids, the arrests, the prosecutions, all designed to clear the field for whatever organization he's really running. The cell walls seemed to dissolve around Vinny. 8 years of believing he'd outsmarted the system. 8 years of thinking he'd turned Agent Chen into his unwitting accomplice, and she'd been suspicious all along. She hadn't been the naive federal agent he'd manipulated. She'd been investigating him. But here's the beautiful part, Martinez continued. Chen thinks she's closing in on him, thinks she's about to expose the greatest deception in federal law enforcement history. What she doesn't know is that we've been watching her watch him. Ghost's footsteps stopped directly outside Vinny's cell. You mean? Chen's been working for us since day one. Every question she's asked, every file she's pulled, every suspicion she's developed, we fed her that information. She thinks she's investigating Vincent Torino, but she's actually been helping us test his loyalty. The revelation hit Vinny like physical violence. Agent Chen hadn't discovered his deception through brilliant detective work. She'd been guided to it, manipulated into suspecting him by people who'd been watching him watch her. The chess game he thought he'd been winning for 8 years had actually been orchestrated by players he'd never seen. So what happens now? Ghost asked. Martinez's voice carried the satisfaction of a man revealing a perfect trap. Now we wait. Chen's supposed to make contact tomorrow, offer him a choice. Admit he's been running a shadow operation or face federal prosecution for fraud. Either way, Vincent Torino's 8-year con finally comes to an end. And Tank? Tank's been useful, but he's served his purpose. Tomorrow's about bigger things than prison politics. As their footsteps faded down the corridor, Vinny sat motionless in his cell, Maria's ring cutting into his clenched palm. Everything he'd believed about his situation had been a lie. Agent Chen wasn't his unwitting accomplice. She was bait in a trap he'd walked into willingly. The federal government hadn't been fooled by his deception. They'd been using it to serve their own purposes. But the most devastating realization was yet to come. He pulled out the death certificate again, reading it with new understanding. Maria Elena Torino died September 18th, complications from pneumonia. Except the date was wrong. Today was September 18th. Maria hadn't died 6 days ago. She died today. The federal marshals had deliberately delayed telling him, timing the news to arrive exactly when they needed him emotionally compromised, which meant Maria's death might not have been natural at all. The baby bracelet in his pocket suddenly felt like evidence rather than a memento. Had they killed his wife to push him toward this moment? Had 8 years of separation and grief been orchestrated to make him vulnerable when they finally moved against him? Vinny closed his eyes and felt 26 years of assumptions collapse. He'd thought he was the puppet master, controlling federal agents and crime families alike. In reality, he'd been the puppet, dancing to music played by handlers who'd been invisible until now. Tank Washington's arrogance in the yard yesterday suddenly made perfect sense. Tank hadn't been asserting dominance over a broken snitch. He'd been following orders, creating the pressure needed to crack Vinny's facade at precisely the right moment. "You think you're smart," Tank had said. But Tank was wrong about who the smart ones really were. As midnight approached, Vincent Torino finally understood that everything he'd believed about his life for the past 8 years had been carefully constructed fiction. Tomorrow would bring Agent Chen's supposed revelation and Tank's planned violence, both designed to force him into whatever corner his real handlers had prepared. But what they didn't know was that learning the truth had freed him from caring about their game entirely, the point of no return. Vincent Torino sat in complete darkness, Maria's wedding ring pressed against his forehead like a talisman against the storm building in his mind. Freedom. The word tasted foreign after 8 years of careful submission, but it was the only truth left standing in the wreckage of his assumptions. They thought they'd broken him by revealing their game. They thought grief and manipulation would drive him toward whatever choice they'd prepared, confession or destruction, surrender or defiance. What they didn't understand was that Vincent Torino had always been most dangerous when he had nothing left to lose. At 12:47 a.m., he made the first decision that mattered. Standing slowly, Vinny moved to his hidden compartment and withdrew the black notebook. 8 years of names, dates, and secrets that could topple governments, but more importantly, 8 years of understanding exactly how the federal system worked from the inside. His handlers thought they'd been watching him, but he'd been watching them too. The pages rustled as he found what he was looking for: Agent Sarah Chen's real personnel file, the one that didn't exist in any federal database. Chen wasn't FBI at all. She was CIA, assigned to a joint task force that had been studying organized crime's infiltration of federal law enforcement since the 1980s. Her investigation of Vincent Torino wasn't about prosecuting mob deception, it was about understanding how deeply criminal organizations had penetrated the government itself, which meant they suspected what he'd really accomplished. Vincent smiled in the darkness, feeling pieces click into place. The raids 8 years ago hadn't eliminated 5 crime families. They'd exposed 5 federal operations that had been compromised by mob infiltration. Every boss he'd supposedly betrayed had actually been a government asset working for competing agencies. The shadow empire he'd built wasn't criminal at all. It was a network of federal agents, prosecutors, and judges who'd been playing all sides for decades. He wasn't the greatest mob informant in history. He was the man who'd discovered that the federal government had become the most successful crime family in America. A soft knock interrupted his revelation. Guard Martinez stood outside his cell, no longer bothering with the pretense of routine patrol. His expression carried the weight of a man about to deliver an ultimatum. "Time to talk, Vincent." Vinny carefully replaced the notebook and approached the bars. "About what?" "About tomorrow. About Agent Chen's visit. About the choice you're going to make." Martinez's voice carried none of its usual institutional authority. Tonight, he was speaking for people who existed in shadows behind shadows. "They want you to understand the stakes." "I understand perfectly." Martinez studied Vinny's face, noting something that made him step backward. The broken old man was gone, replaced by someone who radiated the quiet confidence of absolute certainty. "Do you? Because from where I stand, you're about to lose everything. Your daughter's location, your wife's memory, the protection that's kept you breathing for 8 years. Martinez paused, letting the threat settle. "Unless you're willing to make a deal." Vinny's smile was gentle, almost paternal. "What kind of deal?" "Full cooperation, complete disclosure of your network, names, locations, operational procedures, everything you've built over the past 8 years. In exchange, Isabella stays safe and you spend your remaining years in minimum security instead of a hole in the ground." The offer hung between them like poisoned honey. 8 years ago, Vincent Torino would have calculated angles, weighed options, looked for advantages in any negotiation. Tonight, he simply laughed. "You still don't understand what you're dealing with, do you?" Martinez's hand moved instinctively toward his radio, but Vinny's voice stopped him cold. "Agent Chen isn't here to arrest me. She's here because someone finally realized that Vincent Torino didn't infiltrate the federal government. The federal government created Vincent Torino. Every crime family I supposedly betrayed, every operation I revealed, every secret I traded, all of it was internal housecleaning, designed to eliminate evidence of something much larger." The color drained from Martinez's face. "That's impossible." "Is it?" "Check the dates, Martinez. Cross-reference the prosecutions with budget allocations. Follow the money from seized assets to black budget operations. The mob didn't corrupt federal law enforcement. Federal law enforcement became the mob, and they needed someone to blame when it started falling apart." Vinny stepped closer to the bars, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried the weight of absolute truth. "I'm not their greatest informant. I'm their greatest liability. And tomorrow, when Agent Chen walks through that door, she's not coming to arrest me or flip me or make a deal. She's coming to kill me because I'm the only person left who knows how deep the corruption really goes." Martinez backed away from the cell, his radio forgotten. The conversation had moved beyond prison politics into territory that could destroy careers and end lives. "Tank Washington thinks tomorrow's about respect," Vinny continued. "You think it's about control. Agent Chen thinks it's about justice. But you're all wrong. Tomorrow is about survival, and the only question that matters is whether I am going to die protecting their secrets or live long enough to expose them." As Martinez disappeared down the corridor, Vincent Torino returned to his bunk with the calm precision of a man who'd finally found his war worth fighting. Maria was gone, but her death had shown him the truth. Isabella was threatened, but his surrender wouldn't save her. The game was ending, and it was time to remind everyone why Vincent Torino had never really been the prisoner. Climax. Dawn arrived at ADX Florence like a judgment, cold, absolute, and unforgiving. Vincent Torino stood at his cell window, watching the Colorado mountains emerge from darkness, when he heard the footsteps that would change everything. 3 sets, Agent Chen's measured stride, Martinez's nervous shuffle, and a third he didn't recognize. The executioner's march had begun, but they weren't coming to his cell. They were heading to Tank Washington's. Vinny pressed against the bars, listening to voices carry down the corridor with perfect clarity. Agent Chen's tone was crisp, professional, deadly. "Marcus Washington, you're under federal arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, extortion, and violation of the RICO Act. The recording devices we planted in cell block H captured everything." Tank's roar of rage echoed through the prison. "What recording devices? What the hell are you talking about?" "The ones Vincent Torino has been maintaining for 8 years, Chen replied calmly. "Did you really think we'd place our most valuable intelligence asset in federal custody without protection? Every threat you made, every plan you discussed, every moment you thought you were orchestrating his downfall, all documented." Vinny closed his eyes, feeling the final piece slide into place. They hadn't been watching him to catch him in deception. They'd been protecting him while he gathered intelligence on federal corruption from inside the system itself. Tank Washington, Ghost Walker, even Martinez, all of them had revealed themselves by threatening the man they thought was helpless. Ghost's voice cut through Tank's protests, sharp with sudden understanding. "You played us, all of us. Vincent Torino was never the target. He was the bait." "Mr. Walker is correct," Chen confirmed. "Vincent Torino has been working undercover for the Department of Justice Inspector General's office since his arrest 8 years ago. His mission was to identify federal employees involved in organized crime, using his reputation as a mob informant to make them comfortable revealing their corruption." The sound of handcuffs clicking echoed down the corridor, followed by Tank's bitter laughter. "So the old man was federal all along? After everything we put him through?" "Not federal," Vinny called out, his voice carrying clearly to every cell in the block. "Just tired of watching criminals hide behind badges." Footsteps approached his cell. Agent Chen appeared, flanked by 2 federal marshals, but her expression held respect rather than authority. Behind her, Martinez walked in shackles, his face hollow with the realization that his own words had condemned him. "Mr. Torino," Chen said formally, "your assignment is complete." Vinny studied her face, seeing past 8 years of careful performance to the woman beneath. "How long have you known? About your real identity? Since day one. About your wife's death being natural? Since the autopsy yesterday confirmed pneumonia." Her voice softened slightly. "About your daughter being safe in Oregon under her real name? Since we moved her there 8 years ago." The cell walls seemed to dissolve. Isabella had never been in danger. Maria's death had been genuine grief, not orchestrated manipulation. And Vincent Torino hadn't been a prisoner at all. He'd been the most protected federal agent in American history. "Why?" he asked simply. Chen unlocked his cell with steady hands. "Because someone had to pay for what the federal government became in the 1980s and 90s. Someone had to identify which agents, which prosecutors, which judges had sold their integrity to the highest bidder. And we needed someone the criminal world would trust completely, a man whose reputation was so damaged that no one would suspect he was still working for justice." As the cell door swung open, Vinny thought of Maria's final letter, the words that had sustained him through 8 years of careful performance. "The man I married fought for what was right, no matter the cost." She'd known. Somehow, despite all the protection protocols and operational security, Maria had understood that her husband's disgrace had been his greatest service to the country he'd sworn to defend. Tank Washington recruited 17 federal employees into his smuggling operation, Chen continued, as they walked toward freedom. Ghost Walker identified 43 more across 6 different agencies. Guard Martinez provided access to sealed federal files for organized crime figures in 12 states. The morning sun hit Vinny's face as they reached the prison entrance. Behind them, cell block H was being systematically emptied, not just of prisoners, but of the federal employees who'd believed Vincent Torino was broken enough to trust with their secrets. "What happens now?" he asked. Agent Chen smiled, the first genuine expression he'd seen from her in 8 years. "Now you go home to your daughter. The man who spent 8 years in federal custody was Vincent Torino, mob informant. The man walking out today is Vincent Torino, American hero." As the prison gates closed behind him, Vinny touched Maria's wedding ring in his pocket and whispered a promise to the Colorado sky. "I'm coming home, Isabella. Finally coming home." The game was over. Truth had won.
3 months later, Vincent Torino sat on a porch swing in Salem, Oregon, watching his daughter tend to the garden Maria would have loved. Isabella moved between the tomato plants with her mother's careful precision, 34 years old now, but still humming the lullabies he'd sung to her as a child. She'd inherited Maria's dark eyes and his stubborn chin, a combination that had gotten her through 8 years of believing her father was a traitor. "The basil's coming in strong this year," she called over, dirt smudged across her cheek like a badge of honor. "Mom always said Oregon soil was magic." Vinny smiled, Maria's wedding ring warm against his chest where he wore it on a chain. 3 months of freedom, and he was still learning how to speak without calculating every word, how to breathe without listening for footsteps in corridors that no longer confined him. The house Isabella had built under her assumed name was everything Maria had dreamed of during their last visit's white picket fence, bay windows, a kitchen that smelled like Sunday dinners and fresh coffee. Federal protection had given Isabella a life, even if it had cost her a father for nearly a decade. The reporters called again, Isabella said, settling beside him on the swing. CNN, 60 Minutes, 3 different publishers. They want the real story. Vinny watched a cardinal land on the mailbox, brilliant red against the weathered wood. "What did you tell them?" "That Vincent Torino spent 8 years in the most secure prison in America so other fathers wouldn't have to choose between their families and their integrity." She took his weathered hand in hers, fingers intertwining like they had when she was small and afraid of thunderstorms. "That some stories are worth more than headlines." The swing creaked gently as they rocked together, father and daughter reclaiming rhythms that federal witness protection had stolen. In the distance, Mount Hood caught the afternoon light like a promise that some things endured, despite human corruption. Isabella's phone buzzed Agent Chen, now Deputy Director Chen, sending weekly updates that weren't required but appreciated. Tank Washington had been sentenced to life without parole. Ghost Walker had received 40 years. Martinez and 17 other federal employees were serving sentences that would ensure they'd never again wear badges they didn't deserve. "She says the trials are going well," Isabella reported. 3 more federal judges indicted last week. "The corruption investigation you started has grown into the largest federal law enforcement cleanup in American history." Vinny nodded, remembering cell blocks and whispered conversations. 8 years of careful observation that had finally borne fruit. "Your mother always said justice moves slowly, but it moves. Do you miss it?" Isabella asked quietly. "The game, I mean." "The chess match." He considered the question seriously, watching the cardinal take flight toward trees that had never known razor wire or surveillance cameras. In ADX Florence, he'd been Vincent Torino, the strategist, the manipulator, the man who saw 3 moves ahead. Here, he was simply a father who'd lost 8 years and was determined not to lose one more day. "I miss thinking I was smart enough to control everything," he admitted. "But I don't miss being wrong about what mattered." Isabella leaned against his shoulder, 34 years old, but still his little girl seeking comfort from a man who'd spent 8 years earning the right to provide it. "Mom's letters kept me going, every month like clockwork, telling me stories about the man she married, the one who chose justice over safety, truth over comfort." "She wrote to you?" "Never directly. Through a lawyer who said he was handling the estate, but I knew. The stories were too specific, too full of love." Isabella's voice carried wonder and old pain in equal measure. "She told me about the night you decided to testify against the families, how you sat at our kitchen table until dawn, listing every reason to run and every reason to stay. She said you chose us, not just your family, but every family that would be safer because someone finally stood up. The cardinal returned, this time bringing its mate. They perched together on the fence post, brilliant against the Oregon sky, and Vinny understood why Maria had insisted on hope even when hope seemed foolish. The man who went into prison was Vincent Torino, federal informant, he said slowly. The man who came out as just Vinny Isabella's father, Maria's widower. Someone who's done his fighting and earned his rest. Evening approached with the gentle insistence of seasons changing. Soon, Isabella would start dinner while he read the newspaper cover to cover a luxury 8 years of controlled information had made precious. Tonight, like every night since coming home, he would fall asleep in a bed instead of a cell, wake to birdsong instead of count time, and remember that some victories were measured in quiet moments rather than conquered enemies. As they rose to go inside, Isabella squeezed his hand once more. "Welcome home, Dad." Vincent Torino, American hero, followed his daughter into the house Maria's love had built, finally understanding that the greatest game he'd ever won was the one that let him stop playing.